Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to sqadia.com. My name is Muhammad Osama, and today we are talking about the introduction to the nervous system. In this lecture, we are going to specifically talk about the central nervous system, and we are going to talk about the basic classification of the central nervous system and the coverings of the central nervous system, which are also called as the meninges. And we're also going to talk about the gray and white matter of the central nervous system. So, what is central nervous system? The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord, which is actually enclosed in the appendicular skeleton, which is enclosed in the axial skeleton for its protection, such as brain is enclosed in the skull and the spinal cord is enclosed in the vertebral column, providing it protection. So in the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord are the main centers which are involved in the correlation and integration of the sensory information, and then in the production of the motor response in the response to that sense information or the stimuli that has been received and processed. So both brain and spinal cord, as I already mentioned, are covered by or enclosed in the walls of the skull, and the spinal cord is enclosed in the spinal column, but they have all other or further protection which is provided by the meninges or the coverings of the central nervous system. These meninges are actually the dura mater or arachnoid matter and pia mater, which are actually enclosing these structures and providing them further protection. On the other hand, they are also provided protection by being suspended in the cerebrospinal fluid, providing them buoyancy so that, for example, the brain has buoyancy and would not collide with the floor of the skull or the other areas of the skull, providing it protection and nutrition as well. And as I already mentioned, they are further protected by bones of the skull and the vertebral column. So here you can see, so this is the axial skeleton in which the central nervous system is enclosed, the brain in the skull and the spinal cord in the vertebral column. On the other hand, as we talked about the meninges of the central nervous system, so as I already mentioned, there are three meninges. So the meninges are actually covering the brain in the skull as well as covering the spinal cord in the vertebral column. Another important thing to understand is that the meninges of the brain are actually continuous with the meninges of the spinal cord. So what are these three meninges? As I already mentioned, these include the dura mater, which is the outside, which is the outermost, then the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. There is no space between the dura mater or the arachnoid mater, but there is a space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, which is also known as the subarachnoid space. Now, this space is very important because this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is present. So both in the brain as well as in the spinal cord, the cerebrospinal fluid is present between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater in the subarachnoid space. Now, gray matter and white matter, as we already discussed in the previous lecture that we were talking about, that there are actually the cell bodies and then there are the processes or the axons. Now, those cell bodies are not covered by myelin, which is actually composed of the adipose tissue or the fat. So that fat in the myelin covering actually gives a white appearance. So the cell bodies, whenever they are clustered together, they give a gray color, but when the fibers are clustered together, they give a white appearance because of that myelin sheath, because of that adipose or that fat covering on the around the axons or the processes. So the interior of the central nervous system is organized into gray matter and white matter, and that is what gray matter and white matter is. So gray matter consists of nerve cells embedded in neuroglial cells, and it has a gray color. On the other hand, white matter consists of nerve fibers embedded in the neuroglial cells, and it is a white color, which is due to the presence of lipid material in the myelin sheaths of many of the nerve fibers. So if we look at this picture, there is a difference between the spinal cord and the brain. In the brain, the outer part is actually the gray matter, whereas the white matter is inside the gray matter. because this is the gray matter which is actually the cell bodies. So the fibers arise from here and then they move inside the brain substance, and then they move from the medulla oblongata and then to the spinal cord, and they make the tracts. So that is why the fibers are inside. That is why the color is white in the inside and gray on the outside. However, in the spinal cord it is different. The gray matter is in the center and it is surrounded by the white matter, which consists of the different type of tracts, like the ascending and descending tracts in the dorsal column, ventral column, and lateral columns of the spinal cord. Now, if we look at the major divisions of the central nervous system, majorly we have the brain, also known as encephalon, and the spinal cord. The brain consists of the cerebrum, which is also called as the forebrain, and the midbrain and the hindbrain. The forebrain, or the cerebrum, is further divided into telencephalon and diencephalon. The telencephalon has the cerebral cortex, the subcortical white matter, the commissures, and the basal ganglia, such as substantia nigra. On the other hand, diencephalon majorly consists of thalamus and hypothalamus, as well as the epithalamus and subthalamus. The cerebellum is actually a part of the hindbrain in combination with the pons and medulla oblongata. So cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata make the hindbrain. Cerebellum further has different parts, which is the cerebellar cortex and the cerebellar nuclei. It also has the cerebellar peduncles, which connect the cerebellum with the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. In the brainstem, we have the midbrain, which is also called as the mesencephalon, and two parts of the hindbrain, which is the pons and medulla oblongata. The spinal cord, on the other hand, has white matter and gray matter, and as we already discussed, the outside of the spinal cord, especially if we see it in the cross section, is composed of white matter, and the center is the gray matter. And the white matter, we have the dorsal column, the lateral column, and anterior column, which lodges the different type of ascending and descending tracts. As we already mentioned, so this is the spinal cord, which is divided into different segments depending on the different type of spinal nerves that are originating from it. So it can be cervical, thoracic, lumbar, or sacral. And in the parts of the brain, we have the forebrain, which consists of cortex and diencephalon. We have the midbrain, and we have the hindbrain, which is consisting of pons and medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum, which is posterior to the pons and medulla oblongata, and midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata collectively are making the brain stem. Now, if you talk about the brain lies in the cranial cavity, and it is continuous with the spinal cord through the foramen magnum. The meninges are also continuous with the corresponding meninges of the spinal cord, as we already discussed, and the cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the brain in the subarachnoid space. And the brain is conventionally divided into three major divisions, in the ascending order from the spinal cord. We have the hindbrain, then comes the midbrain, and on the top is the forebrain, and as we already discussed. So in the hindbrain, we have the medulla oblongata, pons, and cerebellum. The midbrain, medulla oblongata, and pons collectively make the brainstem. And the forebrain has two parts, which is the diencephalon and cerebrum. And diencephalon also means between the brain, because it cannot be seen from the outside. And that's pretty much about the summary of these different types or parts of the brain. And here is the during the embryonic development, these are the names given to the different parts of the neural tube which make up for the brain in the development. So prosencephalon is for the forebrain, which has the telencephalon or the cerebral cortex, and diencephalon consisting of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The mesencephalon, which is the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon, which is the hindbrain, which is containing both metencephalon and myelencephalon, consisting of pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. So in this lecture, we talked about the basic classification of the central nervous system, the coverings of the central nervous system, and the gray and white matter of the central nervous system. And then we also talked a little bit about the organization of the brain, which we are going to take a look deeper into the detail in the next section, which we are going to talk in detail about hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. So that was all about this lecture, and I hope you learned something out of it. So keep on watching sqadia.com for more lectures like this. Thank you very much.